This is a paper which looks at, that's a new way, I think, is that fair? A new way to predict sectoral insolvency rates based on simulated firm level data in Austria. So so Klaus, this is you. You're the presenter. You popped up early. That's good. Klaus is head of systemic risk assessment at the Financial Markets Analysis and Surveillance Division at the Austrian Central Bank. So Klaus, the floor is yours, please.
Can you see the presentation properly?
Yes, you may want to put it in slide mode, right? I think.
So better?
There you go. That's better. Thank you. Please.
I can't see.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. This is joint work with two colleagues from the Austrian Central Bank, Jannike Hess and Martin Schneider. It's based on a paper we published about a year ago, and the model, we think, at least at the time of developing it, is a novel approach to get insolvency rates on a sectoral level for the Austrian corporate sector. Usual disclaimers apply, so opinions expressed herein are my own. And to the motivation, I have a background in stress testing, although I'm no longer the head of the stress testing team since the birth of my daughter. But I'm still involved in stress testing, and my background was looking at corporate insolvencies from a stress testing point of view, and I found Martin from the macroeconomics division, who's involved in forecasting, looking at similar questions related to loss potential output. So the two of us, neither of us had a background in the corporate sector, but both of us were interested in insolvency rates. And starting from a very aggregate perspective, we soon found out, when we looked at the containment measures and their impact on economic activity, that due to the sectoral differences of the containment measures, the aggregate picture was not good enough. And we're looking after the same data sources. And since we've worked in the past together, when Martin was providing macroeconomic scenarios for Austrian Central Bank stress tests, we started to work together and tried to tackle the question of corporate insolvencies jointly. So I'm going to present to you today a rather complicated modeling setup. At the core of our model is a Monte Carlo simulation of firm level data. So we model individual firms to get to the sector insolvency rates. We have a macroeconomic scenario that's more or less the shock from the containment measures, the voluntary inactivity, particularly for certain sectors that help spread the virus. We use that scenario via an input-output model and look at the turnover for each sector. And we combine these two in a novel corporate insolvency model that's more or less textbook business. And then we have the mitigating measures. These are fiscal measures, but also EBA's debt moratoria policy and voluntary practices by Austrian banks. And because we have the individual firm level simulated data set, and we have a rather granular profit and loss and balance sheet statement, we can look at the impact of the mitigating measures and can do all kind of counterfactuals. When we assess the mitigating measures, this was the most demanded output of our model, but we could also derive proxies for the probabilities of default in the Austrian bank stress test and have an assessment for questions related to fiscal policy, which other colleagues at the Austrian Central Bank. So I'll go step by step through these components, and then I'll show you the results from 3 different simulation runs, because we've rerun the model quite frequently whenever new scenarios were available or whenever a new set of mitigating measures was introduced. So this is more or less our style and balance sheet and P&L statement. We have 18 variables. We generate them based on two different data sources. One is the BAC database, which is a European database, and the acronyms for the position codes are actually the BAC database codes. And in addition, we have the Sabina database. This is a private database. The first contains about 70,000 incorporated firms in Austria, and the latter one about 110, 120,000 incorporated firms. Unfortunately, we only have firm level data as reported available for equity and cash and bank from the Sabina database. And we only have distributional properties for the other variables, but for our multivariate distribution, we use 4 other variables where we fit distributions via the first quartile and the mean, and then we have a standard normal copula from which we draw 100,000 firms per sector, which we then weight back via the assets. For the other 12 variables, we actually use fractions of the variables we draw from the multivariate normal because we need the more granular breakdown of the profit and loss statement to get the mitigating measures right, but we also sense some numeric stability issue if we would draw out a set of variables in the multivariate normal. So that's a mixture. It's one of the many assumptions that we have done for our model. But at the end, we can generate the simulations, and we can employ the shocks on those simulated firms. What are the shocks? Where are the shocks stemming from? They're usually based around the macro scenario of the Austrian Central Bank's forecast. That's a biannual exercise. And for the purpose of this presentation, I show you the 3 most recent forecasts, so mid-2020, end 2020, and mid-2021. And you can see for the first forecast, there was in the central scenario still only 1 shock, albeit deeper in so the first COVID wave. From the second forecast, we already see a second wave. I'll also show you the results for these 3 scenarios. As for the model itself, we have the shock to turnover from the input-output model. So we have a mean shock per sector. We get the distribution of this shock by fitting a normal distribution with the mean of the sectoral shock and the variance set in a way that it maximizes the distribution between 0 and 1, so that it's the most variant or distributed shock possible that still works with the mean shock. And we shock turnover directly, and we have empirically estimated elasticities for all other income and expense components. The shock is always a shock to the T0, so starting point turnover position. We employ a model that more or less mirrors the static balance sheet assumption of a banking stress test, and we have monthly intervals for forecast. Once we have the impact on the positions, we can calculate a new profit. We tax the profit, and after the tax, we have profit or a loss that we book against the equity position. Following on that, we use a standard textbook cash flow model to also get the liquidity perspective of firm insolvency into the model. So we start by the indirect method with the profit from the profit and loss statement, clean out the non-payment components. Then we have the cash flow after operations. We account for debt repayment in debt financing. As it's static balance sheet, banks cannot draw additional credit outside the mitigating measures that we introduce in a bit. That leads us to the cash flow after financing. Finally, we have investments. Again, static balance sheet disallows any investment of the firms. What we do allow is the fire sale of financial assets. So for the first time a firm has a negative cash flow, it can discard its financial assets. This is very restrictive in the sense of what it can sell, but we are very generous in terms of how it can sell it, so it can sell it immediately at book value, so without incurring any further costs. And that leads us to the cash flow after investments, which we add or subtract to the cash and bank position. The entire modeling setup, the thresholds. So insolvency occurs if the equity position is less than minus 30%, or the cash and bank position is less than minus 10%. The equity position is empirically rather well founded. There are empirical studies that find that insolvency for a set of OECD countries' firms occurs with a debt level of minus 33 to minus 37%. So also we replicate the historic debt rate for insolvent firms of the Austrian sample fairly well with that threshold. And for cash and bank, there is unfortunately no empiric evidence. We started out with actually a position of 0%, but we found out that there were actually solvent firms because they were in our sample with a negative cash and bank position. So we had to account for that. And we found that the results of our model are fairly stable in the interval from, say, minus 5 to minus, or 0 to minus 15%. It just parallel shifts the level slightly, but really, really slightly.
Gosh, you have 5 minutes to go, yeah?
Yes, I'll speed up. Yes, so the entire model, because it relies on quite a number of assumptions, was calibrated in a way that the output of the model mirrored the past or recent insolvency rates on a sectoral basis, and that worked fairly well. So we could introduce the mitigating measures. As you can see from the chart, there are numerous mitigating measures introduced in Austria. We divide them in 3 main groups: capital injections via grants and subsidies, so where firms actually get money that they don't have to repay; long-term deferrals of payment obligations, so long-term liquidity support in the form of credit guarantees or debt moratoria; and short-term deferrals of payment obligations via deferrals of tax payments and social security contributions. Because we have the granular data set and because the law is so prescriptive, we can model these measures very closely to the to codified law. You have to trust me on that, or read the paper, and I'll jump right through to the results. On an aggregate level, you can see in the first row the results for our forecast without mitigating measures, and in the lower row of panels with mitigating measures on the left-hand side on a monthly basis, and on the right-hand side on the cumulated basis. The light blue line is the most recent, or is the, sorry, this is exactly wrong in the legend. So the light blue line is the oldest forecast, and the dark blue line is the most recent forecast. What we can clearly see in the upper row, the insolvency rates without mitigating measures on the left-hand panel, is the spike from the one COVID wave that's really severe, and that it recedes on a cumulated level. We see that independent of the scenario, ultimate levels are fairly close. This relates to the uneven nature in which different economic sectors were hit. So the hardest hit sectors were even harder hit in the first scenario, and that leads, even though the scenario on aggregate is milder because it's only one wave, to as high insolvency rates, in particular in the hardest hit sectors like tourism and arts and recreation. In the lower row, we can see clearly when the measures run out, and I would point to the lower right-hand side panel, where you can really see the step in the light blue line. That's at the beginning of 2021, when short-term payment deferrals run out and the insolvency rate spikes. This changes with the new set of measures in the mid blue line, where this is drawn out, and it changes even more when payment deferral was mitigated out to the future. That fairly straight line more or less mirrors our assumption that once the short-term payment deferral runs out, Social Security cannot file for insolvency immediately for all firms that still owe and cannot pay. And this is really one of the findings. We had insolvency procedures in Austria in 95% of the cases either done by the public sector or as self-declarations. The public sector has more or less stopped to file for insolvency because there are no payment flows incoming, and there are disincentives to file for your own insolvency because you are no longer eligible to the mitigating measures. Looking a bit more closely at the ever-expanding universe of mitigating measures, you can see the decomposition of the individual measures in these charts. Blue is capital injections, green is medium-term liquidity support, and yellow is short-term liquidity support. Sorry, again, the legend is slightly off. And in the black line, the aggregate impact. In gray, you see the simultaneity bias. That's what we call the difference in running simulations, again, with only one set of measures available. And obviously, some measures are used more because firms need more of a single measure or a group of measures than if all measures are available to them at the same time. And we can see in the first line, at first the impact, so the reduction in the insolvency rate, then the spike once the measures run out. That's why the yellow, the short-term liquidity measures, are above the zero line, and then a return to a flat line. We see this much more stretched out in the second row, where there is an expanded universe of mitigating measures. And in the third row, we see how the measures actually start to reverse even in the accumulated impact. And we take from that the measures are now so rich that there is actually the reversal in the accumulated impact observable as well. The more is not always the better in the case of mitigating measures.
So, are you ready to wrap up?
Yes, I'm ready to wrap up. So our model is highly stylized and relies on heroic assumptions. We overestimated the insolvency rates during the COVID pandemic. I mentioned probably the main reason as who starts the insolvency procedures. Nevertheless, we were able to assess the efficiency and efficacy of mitigating measures more or less in real time once we had the model set up. And finally, we were able to, the model was successful enough that we were able to use it in 2 top-down stress tests now, and also because the sectoral perspective is important as well for the most recent climate risk stress test of the Austrian Central Bank. Thanks a lot. Sorry for rushing through the presentation.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Interesting work. So now I think we have your discussion, I hope, ready.
Yes, I am ready. My name is Małgorzata Orzek. I am from University of Warsaw. I will share my presentation with you. Okay, wait a minute. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Yes, you can see it. Okay, that's great. So I will discuss this paper from the academic point of view. So I will not be going too much maybe in these theoretical aspects. Okay, so I will look at the empirical data and I will be focused mostly on the qualitative aspects of the quantitative data which were used in the paper. So I will start with the motivation of the paper. As the authors suggest, this paper employs a novel modeling approach to predict sectoral insolvency rates based on simulated firm-level data in Austria. And the huge, I would say, benefit of the model is that it builds on an empirical data set for non-financial incorporated companies from two types of data sources, the BAC database and the Sabina database, which are huge data sets for non-financial companies. Basically, the merit of this approach, however, as the authors state, lies less in the calculated sectoral insolvency rates themselves, but mostly it is in the model's capacity to compare and rank the efficiency of different mitigating measures which were implemented during the COVID pandemic. As the authors suggest, the model should be additionally applied in the future beyond the COVID pandemic. So this is the first thing. As looking at the related literature, for me, I would say it has one basic shortcoming. It's quite short. Yes, I would somehow try to look at more empirical papers published in not only in the working papers but also maybe in some top ranked journals. I looked at this in the a Science Direct database, and there are a lot of papers on the COVID pandemic and their effects on solvency rates for private companies and on the quality of bank loans. So I think that there is the field which could be somehow improved in your paper. When I was looking through the papers which you referred to, I had several questions. Basically, it looked for me too unfocused. I feel that it would be great if you gave more precise and comparable information about the papers. Because basically in your literature review we have papers which directly measure and simulate the impact of COVID-19 on the insolvency rate, but also there are papers about liquidity, about business failures. There are some papers which separately try to simulate the role of mitigating measures. So as for the hypothesis, I think that it would be great if you give some expectation, the basic hypothesis of your research, because it would streamline the analysis and if you add some thesis or hypothesis. Maybe your basic expectation was that the use of the mitigating measures reduce the insolvency rates. But I think that it was, but it was not written, it was not straightly in the paper. As for the methodology, you presented the methodology quite, in a very, detailed way. However, for me, the hugest challenge of this data set is that only two variables were available at the firm level, and the other were in fact simulated, that these were not real life data. Maybe in the future when the Bureau of Funding will, somehow improve the quality of the data set, it would be great that to use better data set, because now it's quite, I would say, very limited. Yes, the empirical quality of the data and is poor, I would say, if there are so many missing variables. I know this data set, so I know that there are huge troubles with the missing data in this data set. As for the steps, okay, so these are, classical steps for the simulation. You explain what you have done with the data, how you have created your hypothetical firm level data set. However, for me, there was some confusion by the information on the data compilation, because on the one hand, on page 5 and 6, you say that the data was, simulated, but on the other hand, in the data set presented in table A1, I had the impression that the data were directly taken from the database. So maybe you should give more precise information about what were the sources of this data. And for me, I think that it's quite important information. What was the start date for the data set? I couldn't find it in the paper. Maybe it was somehow presented at the bottom margins, but I couldn't find this. I was looking through the paper many times, I couldn't. And what was the horizon of the data set? Yes, it was also very good to add this information. So as for the methodology, as you presented, you applied two macroeconomic scenarios. Two macroeconomic forecasts were discussed by you in your paper, and several, let's say 4 types of mitigating measures were presented as being included in those forecasts. You consider 2 versions on insolvency models. One was without mitigating measures under the 3 macroeconomic scenario, and the other was with the use of mitigating measures under also the 3 macroeconomic scenarios. Comment. I think that there are a lot of assumptions when I was going through the methodology about regarding the input data. For example, elasticities of the industries with respect to turnover. I think you could look at the corporate finance literature to find more real-life examples of those elasticities. One value of elasticities is, I think it's very crude, measure of elasticity. There is also some the assumption about the behavior of firms in making investment decisions. The model is static. I think that this is also quite challenging assumption. Basically, you use classical economic theory to develop the model, and therefore it ignores the current evidence on the psychological aspects on investment decisions. Maybe in the future you could look at the behavioral finance literature to create. I think that it's quite difficult, but maybe this inclusion of this behavioral finance literature would create a more, real-life picture of the simulated behavior of the companies. So you say in the title that you are focusing on insolvency, but in practice, however, you are looking at both insolvency and illiquidity. So maybe you should be more precise when maybe you modify the title, or maybe modify the definition of your insolvency in the introduction, because from the introduction, I had the impression that you are using only the insolvency, which is related to the equity ratios, not necessarily to the illiquidity. So as for the results, I have 2 comments. What is the effect of the implementation of mitigating measures on the industry? You have showed some picture, but maybe it should be directly presented in the paper at the first page, for example, not only. And how valid are your results in comparison with the real data? Because we have some, data which say about the default rates of companies in the year 2020. Maybe, and the conclusions. I think that there are 2 benefits of the paper. The first benefit is that it simulates this insolvency rates of non-financial firms for huge data set, considering 2 regulatory words, with mitigating measures, and the results generally show reduction in insolvency rate due to the use of mitigating measures. However, the paper and the methodology have several challenging features, and I think that if you improve those features, then the model could be sold as a perfect tool for supervisory or supervisory analysis, not only in the Austrian Central Bank, but maybe more widely throughout the world in the European Union. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think I see Klaus smiling, so I'm gonna read that out the question. There's a good question from Hideko Sato in the chat. Could you spell out a little bit on the idiosyncratic feature in 2021 Q1 on the insolvency peak monthly with mitigating measures? So I guess you're getting the same question in many different formats here, right? Yeah.
First of all, thanks a lot for the very, very good discussion of the paper. Many helpful remarks. If we address some of them, I think the paper would, or our model would definitely benefit from it. It was an exercise we did in the crisis period with an immediate question to answer, and now that the dust is settled, I think there are so many valuable ideas there that we will follow up. So thanks a lot. As for the question of the spike, this is the feature of the short-term measures, which ended in January 2021 for the first set of simulations that we did for 2020. So the deferral of payments for social security contributions for incorporated firms and the tax deferrals ended more or less calendar year 2020, and firms were obliged to do double social security contributions starting from January. But the firms' P&Ls were still under duress from shock, as you've seen from the first scenario. The shock was dragging on until mid-2021. So when they would not only have to pay social security contributions once, but twice, because the measure was running out, and we did not foresee any lag, but really automatically a firm for threshold, then it's insolvent. And yes, for the insolvency, we were discussing this with native speakers, and they saw a language service, and they told us that insolvency is indeed the proper term for over-indebtedness and illiquidity. But I'm very happy to reassess. So thanks a lot.
I think the point about making it clear what you then mean is a fair one, right? Just to be, I think, however you choose to do that, right? Look, can I thank both the presenter and discussant here? I think this is, thank you very much. And you have a thank you for Hideki as well. So I would say thank you to all of you for listening in and participating today. We're back tomorrow at 2 o'clock, where we will have another keynote speech by Neil Kasher from the Chicago Booth School of Business on financial service disruptions. And then there'll be two sessions, one on competition and profitability in the banking sector, and then a session on the pricing of climate risks. So there's more tomorrow. So please come back tomorrow at 2 o'clock. And thank you all for being here today. Have a nice evening, if I can use that term, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.